August 7th, 1945. Outskirts of Hiroshima, Japan. The army truck rattled along the broken road, its canvas sides flapping in the warm summer air. Dust rose in a pale cloud behind it, mixing with a faint, metallic smell that none of the men could quite place. Inside, 4 figures in khaki uniforms lurched with every bump. On the tailgate, a white stencil read, "Scientific Investigation Unit." Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Masao Takeda braced his gloved hand against the wooden slats and stared past the driver's shoulders, squinting down the road that led toward Hiroshima. His field cap sat low over wire-rimmed spectacles, and the notebook in his lap was already crowded with the tight, neat characters of a man who trusted data more than feelings. "Distance to the city center," he called over the engine. The driver, a young corporal with soot smeared along his neck, checked the cracked dashboard map. 5 kilometers, sir. Maybe less. 5 kilometers. Takeda nodded and wrote it down. They had started long before dawn, pushing past wrecked rail lines and burned-out farmhouses. Rumor said an enemy bomber or 2 had slipped through. Rumor said some kind of new incendiary. Rumor said half the city had vanished. Rumor said many things. Another jolt. Opposite him, Major Kenji Takahashi. Army engineer clutched a metal case filled with survey instruments, a Geiger counter with headphones, a quartz dosimeter, chemical reagent tubes in padded cloth, the most advanced devices the Empire could scramble together in a night. "You are frowning again, Takahashi," Takeda said quietly. "I am thinking," Sir Takahashi replied. He was broader in the shoulders, sun-darkened with the permanent squint of a man used to looking into blast furnaces and engine exhaust. If it was only incendiaries, the rail line to Ujina should still be usable. Bridges can be targets. Yes, but bridges leave girders. Tracks leave twisted rails. If the reports are true... Takahashi trailed off. His jaw worked. The telephone operator said the line just stopped, as if the city itself stopped answering. The 4th man, Captain Sato, medical officer, pulled a cigarette from a crumpled pack and then, thinking better of it, slid it back. The air already tasted strange. "You have both read the German reports," Sato murmured. "On theoretical fission weapons, chain reactions, city-sized effects." Silence fell inside the truck like another passenger climbing aboard. Takeda had read them. Copies of copies smuggled through neutral embassies, scribbled on and debated in smoky conference rooms in Tokyo. Numbers that were dizzying. Energies that belonged in stars, not in human hands. Japan, too, had its own theorists, its own cyclotrons, its own proud research institutes. He had stood beside humming vacuum chambers and imagined a future where Japanese science was the envy of the world. But those were visions of decades, not a single night. An atomic bomb was a thing of someday, of nightmares and equations, not of yesterday morning. He told himself that again as the truck crested a low ridge. Then he saw Hiroshima. At first his mind refused to read what his eyes delivered. There should have been slate roofs and electric lines, the combed geometry of city blocks stretching toward the delta. A hazy summer sky over smokestacks and tram lines. Instead, there was a color, a flat alien gray that ran unbroken to the horizon like the surface of the moon had been poured into the Otter River Valley. Here and there, jagged fingers of concrete and steel rose blackened and crooked. Between them sprawled an ocean of rubble. The truck slowed, engine dropping to a nervous growl. "What? What is that?" the driver whispered. Takeda did not answer. He was still searching helplessly for the city he had visited twice in peacetime. The tea house near the station, the line of cherry trees along the river, even the ugly new factory blocks the army had ordered up before the war. They were not there. The city had lost its depth. Buildings were not merely destroyed. They were gone, erased down to foundations and a thin dust that seemed to swallow sunlight. You would expect, you tell yourself, broken beams, collapsed roofs, burned walls. Even from the worst American fire raids, there were skeletons of houses, clusters of chimneys, something for the eye to cling to. Here, whole neighborhoods had become a single texture, The corporal eased the truck to a stop where the road simply disappeared into an expanse of pulverized debris. A warped length of rail jutted from the ground at a strange angle, shimmering faintly in the heat. "No crater," Takahashi said hoarsely. His engineer's mind seized on the absence. If it were a conventional bomb of such power, the crater would be vast. Tens of meters across, at least. Takeda stepped down his boots, crunching into something that was not quite soil and not quite ash. He crouched, scooped a pinch of it into his glove. Powdered roof tile, concrete, brick, and something else too fine to name. "You smell that," Sato muttered behind him. The air carried the stench of burned wood and oil, but under it lay a sweet, nauseating note he knew too well from field hospitals. Burned flesh. The smell of a battlefield multiplied until it seemed to seep from the ground itself. Takeda rose and scanned the horizon. Far ahead, a single domed structure still stood stripped and blackened like a skull with its face torn away. Heat rippled between them. "Equip the counter," he said quietly. His voice sounded different here, thinner. "I want readings as we advance." Takahashi nodded and opened the metal case. The Geiger counter was bulky and temperamental, but it was what they had. He clipped the headphones over his ears, adjusted the dial, and frowned in concentration. Takeda watched his face. "Well," Takahashi swallowed. "Background is elevated, sir. Higher than Tokyo by far. Higher than the Navy lab at Kure." He hesitated. "But it is not like standing next to a radium source." "Not that strong? Record it anyway." He did while Takeda took bearings, marking the angle of surviving walls, the direction of scattered debris. Everything screamed of a blast that came from above, hammering the city down in a single instant, rather than rolling through it like a wave. "What kind of bomb does this?" the driver whispered, "and leaves no crater?" You stand with them now in your mind at the edge of that gray sea, trying to imagine an answer. Takeda did not answer aloud. He only pushed his glasses higher on his nose and motioned forward. "We proceed on foot. Masks on. Do not touch anything without gloves." They moved into the ruins, small figures swallowed by a landscape that no longer seemed made for humans. Telephone poles stood here and there, blackened and bent. On one, the transformer had melted and run down its side, frozen mid-drip. Sato's breath rasped through his mask. "It is as if a sun descended here," he murmured. A discarded tricycle lay ahead, its metal frame twisted one wheel, fused to the pavement by heat. Beside it, a dark shape stained the concrete. Takeda paused, his gaze catching on the outline. It was almost human-sized. Arms raised, head turned. A silhouette, a shadow. There was no body. Only that pale shape where someone had once stood between the burning light and the stone. Takeda felt his throat tighten. His scientific training offered him an explanation cool and clinical. Light of unimaginable intensity. A body momentarily blocking it. Surface chemistry changed forever in the pattern of that last instant. But another part of him whispered a simpler verdict that he would not yet let himself believe. This was not incendiary, not high explosive, not anything that belonged to the familiar world of TNT and gasoline. This was something that had rewritten the rules. He looked out across the dead city at the melted glass, glittering where houses had once stood, at the endless gray plain that used to be homes, shops, temples, schools. For the first time, the thought came to him as more than idle theory. Perhaps he thought we have already lost. Takeda stared at the shadow until his vision blurred, until the pale outline stopped being a person and became only chemistry. Again a pattern of light and heat. He forced his mind back into the habits that had carried him through years in laboratories and lecture halls. Measure. Observe. Record. Note the position, he said. His voice sounded calmer than he felt. Orientation of the shadow suggests the source was high, almost vertical. Perhaps a slight angle from the south. Takahashi scribbled in his notebook, then hesitated. If the light came from a point source above, sir, then there should be other shadows on walls, on stairs. If we find enough, we can triangulate. Exactly. They moved on boots, crunching glass. At least Takeda told himself it was glass. Some of it was. Splintered window panes lay in drifts, ground into a glittering powder under the weight of collapsed roofs. But other patches looked wrong. He crouched beside a low concrete foundation, its edge lined with a sinuous, translucent lip, like a wave frozen in mid-splash. It curved back on itself in delicate folds. Takahashi whistled softly. "Is that?" Glass, Takeda said. He reached out with his gloved hand, traced the warped edge. Window glass melted and then hardened again. Glass softens at, 700 degrees? Higher, usually. 900, perhaps more, depending on composition. Sato stepped closer, his mask hanging loose now around his neck. Sweat shone on his temples. Conventional incendiary can produce those temperatures, can it not? Inside a furnace, yes, Takahashi replied. Or a steel plant, but this is an ordinary house foundation. He looked up, taking in the empty air where the building had once stood. And we are seeing this everywhere. It was true. As they walked, they began to notice more of the strange shapes. Bottles sagged over edges like melted candles. Glazed tiles had bubbled and run. In one place, the remains of a small shop door had fused into the concrete threshold, a wavy greenish smear that caught the sun. It is as if the entire city was placed inside a kiln, Takeda murmured. A kiln as large as Hiroshima itself. Ahead, the wreck of a streetcar lay on its side, paint scorched away, metal warped. One end had folded inward windows, gone seats charred. The rails beneath it were bowed, as if some giant hand had pressed the car down and then lifted it away. There were bodies now. Not many, not as many as the devastation suggested there should be, and that absence in itself was unnerving. But here and there in the hollows of collapsed walls, or beside what had once been alleyways, they found them. Some were burned almost black clothes fused to skin. Others lay white and still almost unmarked, as if sleep had simply stopped. Sato knelt by a woman who had fallen half under a shattered beam. Her hair was singed kimono stiff with soot. He touched her wrist out of habit, though already there were flies. "No rigor," he said softly. The heat must have been intense enough to destroy the proteins almost instantly. He moved to another form, this one a child curled on his side, face turned away. Sato did not roll him over. Some of these people died where they stood, he said. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. Whatever happened, it was faster than reflex. You walk beside them in your imagination, feeling the weight of the air, aware of every crunch underfoot. This is not a battlefield where chaos left clear signatures. No shrapnel peppering walls, no impact craters from delayed fuses, no trails of incendiary canisters. It is the aftermath of a single incomprehensible event. A distant clatter made them all stiffen. The driver, who had been trailing behind with the supply pack, swung his head toward the sound. "Someone is alive," he said. There was disbelief in his voice. From behind the overturned tram, a figure stumbled into view. A man in a torn civil defense armband hair, crusted with gray dust eyes, red-rimmed. His skin hung in folds from his arms, blistered and peeling like wet paper. He stared at them for a moment, as if unsure whether they were real. Then he raised one hand in a ragged approximation of a salute. "Water," he croaked. "Please." Sato ran to him, canteen already out. The man's fingers closed around it, trembling. He drank, coughed, drank again. "What happened here?" Takeda asked gently. "Did you see the explosion?" The man closed his eyes as if replaying a memory burned too deep. "I was in the warehouse district," he whispered. There was an airplane, just one far above. The sirens did not even sound. "We thought it was reconnaissance." He swallowed, lips cracking. Then the sky became a second sun, white, white everywhere. I was inside, but it was as if the walls turned to fire. I ran to the doorway, then something hit the building. No wind first, only light. I was blind. When I could see again, everything was gone. He gestured weakly at the landscape around them. There was no sound like the usual bombs, he said. those whistle, those rumble. This was like the world itself cracking open. Sato's hand hovered over the man's arm, careful not to disturb the hanging skin. "How long since the blast?" "Yesterday," the man whispered. Morning. The sky was clear, a full day. 24 hours of slow dying of fires burning themselves out of people crawling from wreckage and then collapsing in the streets. "Did you feel heat on your back?" Takahashi asked, his mind connecting the man's words to the melted glass and the burned shadows. "Yes, I thought my clothes had caught fire." "Flash burns," Sato muttered. On the side facing the explosion, the other side relatively untouched. He checked the man's pupils, then looked at Takeda and gave a slight shake of his head. The damage was far deeper than the skin. The man swayed where he sat, sweat beading on his brow despite the heat. "Rest," Takeda told him. "We will send help." The lie tasted bitter, but what else was there to offer? As they moved on, the Geiger counter began to chatter more loudly in Takahashi's headphones. It was not the furious, constant roar of a strong, focused source, but a brisk, insistent clacking. He adjusted the scale, watched the needle jump higher. "Sir," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "The radiation level is increasing as we approach the center." "How high?" "Several times, normal already. Perhaps more. These instruments were never calibrated for an event like this." "Radiation from what the driver asked." "We have no reactors, no radium factories here." Takeda did not answer. The thought had been circling him since he first saw the flattened city, but he had kept it behind a wall of professional caution. Now, with the counter ticking like an insect in Takahashi's hands and the melted glass at his feet, that wall began to crack. If this was fission, he thought, if the enemy has managed to turn the heart of the atom into a weapon, then every calculation we made about this war is meaningless. In Tokyo, in lecture halls and ministries, they had argued about oil and steel, about ship tonnage and aircraft production. They had spoken of attrition, of delaying actions, of bargaining positions. None of that mattered if the sky itself could open over a city and erase it in a single flash. He looked at the others, at their sweat-streaked faces and dust-coated uniforms. Japan's scientific pride, he realized, was walking through the proof of its own failure. "Continue toward the dome," he said quietly, pointing to the skeletal domed ruin that still stood on the horizon. "If there is a hypocenter, it will be near there. We must see it with our own eyes." You can feel the reluctance in their steps, the knowledge that every pace brings them closer to something no textbook has prepared them for. The Geiger counter clicked faster. The shadows on the walls grew sharper, stranger, more numerous. Here a figure frozen mid-stride on a staircase. There the outline of a worker leaning against a low wall. Lives distilled down to silhouettes and stains. The city of Hiroshima had become a laboratory for a new kind of fire, and the men who had once believed they understood the rules of nature were about to admit fully how little their understanding meant. By late morning, the heat rose in shimmering curtains from the open plain that had once been Hiroshima's heart. The domed ruin that Takeda had chosen as his landmark loomed larger now, its copper roof peeled and scorched its windows, blasted out so completely that the openings looked like empty eye sockets. The Geiger counter's chatter had settled into a steady, unnerving tempo in Takahashi's headphones. He had stopped giving exact readings and simply called them out in rough multiples. 10 times normal, he said. 12, perhaps more. The driver wiped his forehead. "Is that dangerous, Major?" Takahashi hesitated. In the laboratory, among lead shields and carefully handled vials, there were charts for dose and exposure, tidy tables that mapped invisible rays to measurable harm. Out here, with the city turned to dust, those tables felt like jokes. "Prolonged exposure would be," he said finally. "For now, we watch for nausea, dizziness. If anyone feels sick, you say so." Sato let out a short, humorless laugh. "Everyone in this city is sick," he said. "They just do not know what to call it." They passed what had once been a bridge. The concrete pylons still stood in the shallow riverbed, but the railings and deck were gone, stripped clean as a bone. On the far bank, a handful of figures moved slowly among the ruins' bandages, fluttering pale against their skin. No one called out to the army team. Some watched with flat curiosity. Others did not look up at all. Takeda's attention was caught by a patch of ground near the bridge approach. The surface there was not the grey dust of pulverized buildings, but a smooth, glassy crust that reflected the sky in fractured, cloudy patches. He knelt, ignoring the protest from his knees. "Vitrified soil," he murmured. "The earth itself has melted." Takahashi joined him, crouching carefully. "The Germans theorized something like this," he said, voice low. "Ground scorching, thermal pulses. But they were always speaking of tests in deserts, not cities." Takeda looked up sharply. "You think this is that?" Takahashi held his gaze. "If not, then we are witnessing a phenomenon unknown to modern physics." They both knew what that meant. The atom. The chain reactions that had danced in their calculations for years, now written across a Japanese city in melted earth and glass. They crossed the bridge's skeletal remains and walked into the shadow of the domed building. Up close, its walls were a patchwork of peeled concrete and exposed steel rods. The interior was choked with debris, twisted beams, and chunks of masonry piled in strange directional patterns. "Note the blast vector," Takeda said, pointing. "Debris thrown inward on the north side, outward on the south. The pressure was nearly vertical here, but with a slight angle." He paced, counting off strides, marking compass bearings in his notebook. Surviving stumps of walls, bent lampposts, even the way shards of tile lay scattered, all told the same story. A wave of pressure had swept downward from the sky, radiating from a point somewhere above them. "The Americans have not developed a bomb that detonates in the air with such force," the driver muttered. "Have they?" "They have now," Sato said. Inside the building's shell, they found more shadows. On a stairway leading nowhere, the silhouette of a man's head and shoulders was etched into the wall above the landing. Where his eyes would have been, the wall was unmarked, protected for a fraction of a second by his own skull before vapor and flame claimed them both. Takahashi reached out but stopped short of touching the outline. "This is not simply heat," he said. "It is light. Light with the force of a hammer." "It is all the same thing," Takeda replied softly. "Energy, concentrated momentarily in a place where it does not belong." They stepped back into the open. The sun climbed higher, but its warmth felt feeble compared to what had passed through this place a day before. Sato had wandered a little away from the group toward what looked like the remains of a small park. A few blackened tree trunks stood there, their bark blasted off on one side, leaves completely gone. On one trunk facing the direction of the blast, the wood was charred almost white. He touched it gently. The tree crumbled under his fingers, collapsing into a powder that drifted on the hot air. Living tissue turned to this, he said. Instantly, a sudden wave of fatigue washed over him. His stomach clenched in a brief, sharp spasm. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly. "Doctor," the driver called. "Are you all right?" Sato straightened. "Heat and smell," he said. "Nothing more." He met Takeda's eyes, and both of them knew it might not be nothing. The Germans had written about delayed sickness, about bone marrow and blood. Invisible bullets that kept moving long after the blast had passed. They pressed on into the districts closer to what the surviving maps labeled as the city center. Here, even the concrete foundations thinned out. There were sections where there was nothing taller than a man's waist in any direction, just a rough, undulating plain of broken tile. Splintered beams and anonymous gray dust. "Put your hand out," Takeda said suddenly. Takahashi frowned. "Sir, humor me." They both stretched their arms toward the horizon, fingers spread. From this vantage, it was possible to imagine the city as it had been, to fill in the outlines of the missing rooftops with memory and guesswork. "Now cover one eye," Takeda said, doing the same. "Imagine plot points, buildings of 3 stories or more, factories, schools, the municipal offices. Count how many you can actually see, not their ruins." They stood in silence for a long moment. A single charred chimney here, a fragment of wall there, the domed ruin behind them. 3, Takahashi said finally. "Maybe 4. In all directions," Takeda replied. He lowered his hand, the gesture sharp with decision. There is no conventional explanation for this. Even the worst of Tokyo's firestorms left districts standing. Strings of buildings, at least. He snapped his notebook shut. I'm recording this as a single explosion of a magnitude unprecedented in human warfare detonated in the air, with blast thermal and radiation effects far beyond anything achievable with chemical means. The words felt heavy in the air like a verdict. Atomic Takahashi said quietly. He did not whisper it as a theory anymore, but as a recognition. It can be nothing else. The driver stared at him. But our own physicists said such weapons were impractical, he protested. Too much uranium, too difficult. Years away. Takeda thought of chalk-dusted professors in Tokyo, of polite seminars where men spoke in cautious, measured tones about isotope separation and critical masses. He remembered the confidence, the assumption that if it was hard for Japan, it must be hard for everyone. We assumed the enemy faced our difficulties, he said. We assumed they progressed at our pace. He looked around at the melted bottles and the fused roof tiles, the shadows burned into walls where people had stood. Our assumptions are lying in front of us. For the first time that day, anger flared in him, hot and clean. Not at the Americans, though there would be time for that. At his own country's leaders, at the admirals and ministers, who had brushed aside the warnings of isolated, worried physicists. At the generals who'd poured resources into planes and ships while treating the atom like an amusing dream, a distant possibility. All at once, the silence of Hiroshima became suffocating. The only sounds were the hiss of small fires still smoldering in the depths of collapsed basements, the distant moans of unseen wounded, and the relentless tick of the Geiger counter. Takahashi lifted the headphones from one ear. We should not stay much longer, he said. Whatever this radiation is doing, it is doing it to us as well. We have seen enough, Takeda agreed. He turned one last slow circle, committing the panorama to memory. A city erased, not conquered, not occupied, simply removed from the ledger of living places. Somewhere in some airfield, the Japanese scouts had not bombed, men had loaded a weapon that did this into the belly of a single aircraft and sent it on its way as calmly as if they were flying another bombing run to Osaka or Nagoya. What defense was there against such a thing? More anti-aircraft guns, more fighters. Even if they shot down one plane, 10 more could come. A single leak in the net would be enough. No defense, he thought the words forming themselves with horrifying clarity. Not for cities, not for armies in the field, not for anything that cannot burrow into the earth and hide like a worm. He did not speak that conclusion aloud. Not yet. But it sat between them as they began to retrace their steps through the ruins, a silent companion, heavier than their packs. The way back toward the truck felt longer, as if the shattered streets had stretched in the heat. The men retraced their steps, but the city did not repeat itself. New details emerged where earlier their minds had refused to focus. Here, a row of fire hydrants bent outward, their tops sheared clean off and scattered in a line that pointed back toward the vanished center. There, a drain cover twisted like soft wax, its lattice pattern half sunk into the bubbled pavement. Takeda forced himself to keep writing. Radius of total destruction. Approximate distance from hypocenter to surviving structures. Angle of blast on isolated walls. Numbers, sketches, arrows in the margins. This will let us estimate the equivalent in TNT, he said, more to steady himself than anything. The Americans measure the strength of their bombs in thousands of tons. We can at least speak to them in their own language. Takahashi nodded distractedly. His eyes were bloodshot, his uniform dark with sweat at the collar. A single device to replace an entire fleet of bombers, he muttered. Their B-29s burned cities already. Now they have this on top of it. You can sense the calculation forming in his head. Aircraft production bomb loads number of targets. It no longer leads to any answer that looks like survival. As they reached the district where more buildings still stood in fractured half-forms, a new sound seeped into the background. Low, continuous, like the hum of distant insects. Not insects. Voices. Around a street corner that no longer had houses to anchor it, a schoolyard opened up. The main building had lost its roof and part of its front wall, but the remaining classrooms had become a makeshift aid station. Dozens of people lay on mats and bare floorboards. Some were wrapped in bandages that had already bled through. Others had only blankets over their shoulders, skin exposed to the smoky air. Children whimpered. An old man coughed a wet, tearing cough that shook his whole frame. The smell hit them like a physical blow. Slaked, lime-burned cloth exposed flesh and something sharp and metallic that did not belong in any hospital. A local army medic in a stained armband looked up as they entered. His eyes flicked to their insignia and the metal case of instruments lingering a fraction longer on the Geiger counter. "You are from Tokyo?" he asked, voice hoarse. "From the General Staff Scientific Section," Takeda replied. "We were ordered to assess the weapon used here." The medic let out a bitter little breath. "Then write this in your report, Doctor. Whatever they did to this city, our textbooks do not cover it." He gestured around. "I have burn patients, yes. Flash burns mostly on one side. Eyes destroyed by the light. Those we understand. But then there are the others." He led them to a corner where 3 men and a woman lay on mats. Their clothes were singed at the edges but largely intact. The skin on their faces and arms looked reddened but not charred. One tried to sit up as they approached, then doubled over, retching. Nothing came up. He gagged dryly until Sato knelt and steadied his shoulders. "When were they injured?" Sato asked. "They were not injured," the medic said. "Not in the usual sense. They walked here themselves yesterday, some from as far as the northern suburbs. They had only minor scratches, dust in their hair. We cleaned them, gave them water. They spoke to us, worried about their families, asked if the fires would reach certain districts. And now they vomit until they have nothing left. They complain of headache, then their hair begins to come out in clumps." As if summoned by the words, the woman raised a shaking hand to her head. A few dark strands slid free between her fingers and drifted down onto the mat. She stared at them, bewildered. "My teeth hurt," she whispered. Her gums were swollen, a faint line of blood at their edge. Sato's face tightened. He lifted the woman's eyelids, checked her pupils, then took her wrist. Her pulse hammered against his fingers far too fast. "What of fever?" he asked. "High," the medic said. "But it comes and goes. They complain of chills even in this heat." Sato looked at Takeda. In that look was the echo of those German reports of notes on laboratory accidents where researchers who had been close to powerful sources of radiation seemed unhurt at first, only to sicken and die days or weeks later. "This is the invisible part of the explosion," Sato said quietly. "The part that does not knock down buildings or set wood alight." "Radiation sickness," Takeda answered. The words felt unreal in his mouth, like speaking of a ghost. "We knew it existed in theory, in small doses in controlled experiments." He swept his arm, taking in the whole schoolyard of suffering. "We are seeing it now on a scale no one imagined." The medic sank onto a crate. Lines of exhaustion carved deep into his face. "I've tried antiseptics. Sulfur. Nothing changes. The ones most exposed to the flash die quickly. The ones a little farther away die slowly." "Have you noticed if those with less visible burns are faring worse than you would expect?" Sato asked. "Yes," the medic said. "It is as if their injuries are on the inside." Inside the marrow, Takeda thought. Inside the blood. The atom has opened, and its fragments are walking through these people, cell by cell. He moved back toward the doorway, needing air even if it tasted of smoke and ash. Outside, the light seemed too bright. His hands shook as he took out his notebook again. "Our calculations were wrong from the beginning," he said. "We told the General Staff that if such a weapon were built, its main effect would be blast. We said radiation would be a secondary concern confined to the immediate vicinity." He glanced back into the school where the woman still stared in mute horror at the hair in her hand. "We did not understand how much energy could be released at once," he went on. "We treated the atomic nucleus like a curiosity, a laboratory toy." Takahashi joined him at the steps. "We thought we had time," he said. "Years. enough to win the war or lose it on other terms. Behind them, the Geiger counter clicked steadily. Its sound had become part of the air, like the cicadas that should have been singing in the trees but were strangely absent here. "Listen to that," the driver said. "It has not stopped since we entered the city. It is like a clock." Takeda looked out over the ruins toward where the harbor would be, and beyond that, the open sea. Somewhere out there, American ships moved with impunity. Above them, American planes cruised at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach. "If this is a clock," he said, "it is not counting time in seconds. It is counting in cities." He imagined the same flash over Osaka, over Nagoya, over Tokyo itself, where the emperor's palace sat at the heart of a city already scarred by fire bombings. How many bombs did the Americans have? 1 to 10. Enough to erase every major urban center in the home islands. The truth was, he did not know. No one in Japan knew. That ignorance, more than the radiation or the melted glass, hollowed him out. Scientific pride had been the belief that with enough time and effort, Japanese minds could match any Western discovery. Here, on August 7th, 1945, walking through a city that had become a diagram of their failure, that pride began to feel childish. "Pack up the instruments," he said at last. His voice was flat. "We will return to the command post and get this report transmitted to Tokyo. Every hour we delay our superiors, make decisions based on a world that no longer exists." As they left the schoolyard, a little girl on a mat lifted her head and watched them go. One of her arms was wrapped from shoulder to wrist, fingers poking out of the bandage like pale roots. Her gaze was not pleading. It was puzzled, as if she too could sense that something deeper than buildings had been destroyed. You follow them out of the yard and back into the glare, feeling with them the strange weight in the air. They have measured enough to know the shape of the catastrophe. Now they must carry that shape into rooms where men still talk of counterattacks and negotiated peace. The truck groaned back into motion, its tires crunching over the loose rubble that had once been a road. As Hiroshima receded behind them, the gray pall of dust and smoke thinned, replaced by green fields that looked almost obscene in their normalcy. No one spoke for a long time. The city's silence had followed them into the truck, filling the spaces between their breaths. Takeda sat with his back against the wooden slats, notebook open on his knees, but untouched. Every time he tried to write, the images flashed behind his eyes. The shadow of the tricycle, the hair slipping from the woman's hand, the melted line of glass on the foundation. The truck hit a rut. His stomach lurched, and with it came a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the road. He swallowed hard, tasted bitter bile. Sato noticed. "How long have you felt that way?" "Since the school," Takeda admitted. "It will pass." Sato regarded him for a moment, then looked away. His own hands were trembling slightly, a fine tremor that made the canteen rattle against his belt. "Short exposure," he said, as if reciting from a manual. "Low to moderate dose. Symptoms may include fatigue, nausea, headache. If we are fortunate, that is all." "And if we are not?" the driver asked quietly. "Then we will have the dubious honor of contributing to the Empire's first large-scale study of radiation effects on humans," Sato replied. There was no humor in his tone. The road curved along a low hill. From its crest, they could see the city once more. From this distance, Hiroshima looked almost peaceful, a gray stain surrounded by summer green smoke rising in thin threads. Takeda forced himself to look. "Remember that view," he said. "That is how the general staff will see it. A mark on a map, a list of numbers." He closed his notebook with a snap. "We must give those numbers meaning sharp enough to cut their illusions." By early afternoon, they rolled into the Army command post on the outskirts, a cluster of requisitioned buildings and tents that had escaped the worst of the blast. Telegraph wires sagged between improvised poles. Couriers on bicycles weaved around stacked crates of supplies. The truck had barely stopped when a staff captain hurried over, dust puffing from his boots. His uniform was immaculate, collar razor straight, as if the war existed for him mainly in dispatches and arrows on maps. "You are the investigation team?" he asked. "The general and the army minister have been asking for your findings since you left." "We have findings," Takeda said. "They will not like them." Inside the main building, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of sweat. Ceiling fans turned lazily, barely stirring the heat. A large map of the Chugoku region covered one wall Hiroshima marked with a neat circle, and the note, "Enemy Special Bomb Attack." 3 senior officers stood around a table cluttered with reports. Major General Nakajima, his hair gone to steel gray, turned as the team entered. Beside him, Colonel Ishii from the General Staff's Operations Section and a naval liaison in blue trim. "You have been to the city," Nakajima said. "We need specifics. Was it a fuel-air device? A new form of incendiary?" Takeda's throat felt dry. He bowed, then straightened and met the general's gaze. "Sir, with respect, if we begin by discussing incendiaries, we're already lying to ourselves." A faint flicker crossed Ishii's face. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" Takeda laid his notebook on the table open to a crude sketch of the ruined dome and the radial pattern of destruction around it. "We measured no crater at any point," he said. "The blast appears to have originated in the air at a height of perhaps several hundred meters. The overpressure was enough to flatten wooden structures out to a radius of more than 2 kilometers. Concrete buildings were gutted. Roof tiles, window glass, even soil were melted." He flipped to another page, showing hastily calculated estimates. "Based on observed damage compared to known effects from conventional bombing, I estimate the explosive yield equivalent to at least 15 to 20,000 tons of TNT. Possibly more." The naval officer let out a sharp breath. "That is impossible." Takeda looked at him. "I walked through the impulsor. You believe this to be an atomic weapon, is that it?" The word hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. The ceiling fan creaked once, pushing warm air lazily around the room. "Yes, sir," Takeda said. "I believe the Americans have succeeded where we only theorized. I believe Hiroshima was destroyed by the fission of uranium or a similar material." The naval officer shook his head sharply. "Our own experts said such a device would require factories the size of cities. Entire rivers' worth of electricity. The Americans are not gods." "No," Takeda replied. "They are simply ahead." He turned a page, revealing a rough diagram of the city, with circles penciled in around a central point. The damage is almost symmetric. A single flash. No evidence of multiple high explosives. No incendiary clusters. Survivors report an intense white light, a heat more severe than any firebombing, and then a blast that threw them like dolls. He tapped the innermost circle. "At this radius, people did not burn. They vanished. We found shadows burned into stone glass, fused into walls, soil vitrified. And beyond the blast radius, we are already seeing what we can only call radiation sickness among those who appeared uninjured yesterday." Ishii cleared his throat. "We have seen strange effects before. Vaporization, perhaps an oil depot," Colonel Takeda said, and there was iron in his voice now. "With respect, I have spent my career measuring explosives, TNT picric acid incendiary mixtures. I've built models of firestorms and blast fronts. Nothing in the world of chemical reactions can account for what I saw this morning. Nothing." He straightened, feeling the room tilt slightly under him. "We are facing physics, not rumors. The energy released in Hiroshima can only have come from within the nucleus of the atom." Silence again. This time it felt heavier. Nakajima's fingers drummed once on the table, then stilled. "Very well," he said. "Assume you are correct. What is your assessment of our defensive posture against such a weapon?" The question was formal, almost routine. Takeda realized that some part of the general was still hoping to slot this new horror into familiar categories: enemy capability countermeasure, countermeasure. "Our defensive posture," Takeda said slowly, "does not exist." The general's eyes hardened. "Explain." Takeda swallowed. His mouth was dry, his tongue thick. "The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was delivered by a single aircraft," he said. "One bomb. One plane." Our radar did not sound the alarm in time. The sirens did not even wail. He saw again the civil defense man with his peeling skin saying, "We thought it was reconnaissance. We can deploy more fighters, more anti-aircraft guns," Takeda continued. "We can improve radar, but no barrier is perfect. One aircraft can slip through as this one did, and with each slip, another city dies." He looked each officer in the eye in turn. "We cannot harden a city against the sun exploding above it. There is no shelter for wooden houses, for paper walls, for civilians in the open. Even deep bunkers can be compromised by radiation and heat." The naval officer bristled. "We are Japanese," he snapped. "We have fought against odds before. The enemy cannot have many of these weapons. They are too complex, too expensive. Perhaps this was their one demonstration, a threat to force us to surrender." Perhaps, Takeda said. Or perhaps not. He hesitated only a heartbeat, then let the thought out. If the Americans have built one device, they have built more. No nation would invest such effort for a single bomb. They may be limited, but we do not know how limited. One more, 10 more, enough to erase the industrial heart of the home islands. The room seemed to shrink as the possibilities crowded in. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kokura, each with its own neat circle on some American map. Ishii adjusted his glasses. "Could we build one ourselves?" he asked, almost plaintively. "If we concentrated our remaining resources, if we begged the Germans for their remaining data." Takeda felt a laugh rise in his chest, wild and bitter, and forced it down. "Colonel, we could perhaps have begun to build the factories that build the machines that enrich the uranium," he said. "Years ago, before Saipan, before B-29s flew over our cities. Now, with our shipping strangled and our industry in ruins," he let the question hang. "This is not a race we can still enter," he said softly. "The starting gun went off years ago. We are standing on the track watching the dust of the runner." A flush spread across Ishii's cheeks. "So your professional judgment," he said, each word clipped, "is that the Empire is defenseless against this new weapon?" "Yes," Takeda answered. "Completely defenseless." The word completely seemed to land in Nakajima's shoulders. They slumped just a fraction, but enough. For a moment, the general looked older than his years, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "And our scientific position?" he asked quietly. "Your branch has argued for years that Japanese physics is the equal of any Western power." There it was, the soft underbelly of pride, the belief that intellect could balance factories and oil reserves. Takeda thought of the cyclotrons hidden in basements, the chalkboards crowded with equations the earnest young researchers who had whispered about chain reactions in corridors and then been ignored in procurement meetings. "Our theories were sound," he said. "Our minds are not inferior, but we lacked the industrial base, the political will, the time. Science cannot leap without a ledge to push from." He looked down at his own hands, stained with the dust of Hiroshima. "Yesterday, our scientific pride died in that city, along with everything else. Whatever prestige we imagined we had as a modern nation is gone. The enemy has crossed a threshold we are still standing in front of, arguing about whether to open the door." Nakajima nodded once sharply, like a man accepting a painful but necessary diagnosis. "Very well," he said. "You will dictate a formal report. We will send it to Imperial General Headquarters and to the Foreign Ministry." He turned to the Naval Liaison. "And you will ensure the Navy Ministry receives a copy at once. They must understand that their fleet cannot shield our cities from this." "Yes, sir." A staff sergeant rolled in a clattering field telephone and a cipher clerk with an armful of code sheets. Takeda sat at the table, the wood grain swimming in his vision for a moment before it steadied. "Ready, Doctor?" the clerk asked. Takeda took a breath. Outside, through the open window, he could hear cicadas at last, their shrill chorus rising from the trees beyond the compound. Life continuing blind to the new sun that had appeared in the human sky. "Begin," he said. He spoke slowly, each sentence shaped like a blade. "Casualties enormous. Physical destruction near total within a radius of 2 kilometers. Nature of weapon, atomic fission device, airburst yield on the order of tens of thousands of tons of TNT, Thermal blast and radiation effects beyond any known conventional weapon. No practical countermeasure available with current Japanese capabilities. He did not soften his language. There was no time for politeness. Every word that admitted helplessness cut across decades of rhetoric about divine winds and imperial destiny, but he let them stand. When he was done, the clerk's pencil hovered over the last line. "Message classification," he asked. "Top priority," Nakajima said. "To be transmitted at once." The cipher clerk began to transform Takeda's sentences into strings of numbers and syllables, wrapping the death of a city in layers of code that would flash along wires to Tokyo. As the men dispersed to their duties, Takeda rose too quickly. The room swayed, and he caught himself on the edge of the table. A hot flush ran through him, followed by a deep chill. Sato was at his side in an instant. "Sit," he said quietly. "You are pale." "You said short exposure would be tolerable," Takeda replied. His teeth chattered, once betraying him. "It may still be," Sato answered. "Or it may not. We have stepped into a field with no maps." Takeda sank back onto the chair. His bones ached, a deep, dragging fatigue settling into them. Outside, the telegraph key began its frantic clacking, sending their verdict racing toward men who still believed wars were decided by divisions on maps and ships in harbors. He closed his eyes and saw not the outlines of battleships or aircraft, but the shadow of a child's tricycle fixed forever on scorched stone. Evening dropped over the command post in heavy layers of gold and purple. In the west, the sky above Hiroshima glowed faintly, a dull band where smoke and dust still hung in the upper air. The investigation team sat at a rough table outside the barracks, enamel cups of weak tea in front of them. None of them drank. Flies circled lazily, then veered away from the smell of sweat, antiseptic, and fear that clung to their uniforms. Takahashi was the first to break the silence. "When this reaches Tokyo," he said, "do you think they will believe it?" "They will have to," Sato answered. "They will have no choice." Takeda stared at his own hands, fingers laced loosely around the cup. The tremor was still there, subtle but persistent. His head felt stuffed with cotton. Thoughts moved through it like men slogging through mud. "They will have many choices," he said finally. "They can believe we are exaggerating. They can decide the Americans have only one bomb. They can decide that the Emperor's spirit will shield the capital." He raised his eyes toward the darkening east, toward where Tokyo lay beyond the horizon. "What they cannot decide is the energy inside the atom. That decision has already been made for us. In laboratories across the ocean, in factories we never saw." A runner approached at a trot, pausing to bow. "Lieutenant Colonel Takeda, sir," a reply from Tokyo. "For the general." He handed over a folded message form and hurried on toward the main building. The men watched him go, as if the paper he carried were a fuse. Inside, in the stuffy map room, Nakajima read the message under the yellow glare of a single bulb. His lips moved slightly as he traced the characters. "Imperial General Headquarters acknowledges. Preliminary report. Stop United States announces use of new type bomb against Hiroshima. Stop enemy radio claims experimental device of extraordinary power based on atomic fission. Stop further investigation and verification. Ordered, stop, prepare. Additional details on damage and casualties. Stop." Below that, in a different hand, another line had been added from somewhere higher up the chain. "Military position remains grave, but not hopeless. Stop, continue. All operations with utmost determination. Stop." Nakajima let the paper fall to the table for a moment, then picked it up and walked out to where the scientists sat. The cicadas had grown louder, buzzing like an enormous field telephone in the trees. He laid the message on the table between them. "The Americans themselves," he said, "have announced it. They call it an atomic bomb. They boast about what it can do." Takeda read the lines slowly, lips pressed tight. For a strange moment, seeing his own conclusions echoed in the words of the enemy, he felt something almost like vindication. Then that feeling curdled, because what did it matter to be right about a weapon that could erase cities? He tapped the last sentence. "Grave, but not hopeless," he said. They still speak as if this is another kind of artillery. One more factor to weigh. Nakajima's jaw clenched. An army that admits hopelessness ceases to be an army, he replied. There are rules for what a general may say, even to himself, and rules for what a physicist must say, Takeda answered. He folded the paper carefully as if it might shatter. General, you asked us for our professional judgment. You received it this afternoon. Nothing in this message from Tokyo changes what we saw with our own eyes. He hesitated, then went on. You have fought in China. You have watched artillery batter positions and infantry advance into the gaps. You know what it means for courage to make a difference. Yes, Nakajima said quietly. This weapon does not care about courage, Takeda said. It does not care about esprit or bayonet charges or the emperor's portrait in a soldier's pack. It cares about distance from the hypocenter, about shielding, about probabilities. It is a machine that turns our people into equations. He did not raise his voice, but the words felt like blows on the humid air. Then what do you suggest I tell Tokyo, Nakajima asked. What does a general say if not, continue operations? Takeda looked past him toward the gray smear of Hiroshima on the horizon. Lights flickered faintly there, now small fires or lanterns among the ruins. You tell them, he said slowly, that if they continue to fight, they are gambling our remaining cities on the enemy's stockpile of these bombs. You tell them that one aircraft slipping through once can do what 10,000 sorties of conventional warplanes cannot. You tell them that whatever else this war is, we are now fighting a nation that has learned to open the core of matter and drop it on our heads. His eyes met the general's. They were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion, but steady. And then he finished, you tell them there is no technical path to victory anymore. Only paths to different kinds of defeat. The words hung there. For a moment, no one spoke. Somewhere nearby, someone coughed a dry bark. A telephone rang, was snatched up, barked into, slammed down. The normal routines of a military post went on around a conversation that was anything but normal. Nakajima inhaled, held it, then let it out slowly. He looked older than he had that morning by a full decade. I will send another message, he said, with stronger language. I do not know if anyone in Tokyo will dare to read it as plainly as you have spoken it here, but it will be on the record. He turned to go, then paused. You realize, Doctor, he said, that some will call this defeatism, that they will call you unpatriotic. Takeda smiled without humor. This morning I walked through streets where patriotism lay in gray dust up to my ankles, he said. Whatever they choose to call me will not bring those people back. Later, much later, after a hurried meal that no one tasted, after another round of cursory examinations by Sato that revealed nothing decisive except a deepening fatigue. In all of them, the men lay on their cots in a dim barracks. In the darkness, their voices were thin threads. Do you think they will surrender, the driver asked. Takahashi shifted the bed springs, creaking. The Navy still clings to the idea of a decisive battle off the coast, he said. The Army dreams of making the Americans bleed on Kyushu until they negotiate. And you, the driver, pressed. There was a long pause. I think Takahashi said at last that what we saw today removed the ground beneath those dreams. On his cot, staring up at the shadowed rafters, Takeda listened to the sound of his own breathing. Each inhale felt slightly too shallow, as if the air were thinner than it had been yesterday. His skin prickled hot and cold in waves. He thought of the young physicists he had mentored, their excitement when they first learned about chain reactions, about the possibility that a single neutron could trigger a cascade. They had spoken of energy for industry, of ships powered for years without fuel, of a future where Japan would never again depend on imported oil. In none of those conversations had anyone seriously spoken of dropping that same power on a city. The idea had existed, yes, but as something obscene, an edge of possibility best left unexplored. Somewhere in American laboratories and boardrooms, men had made a different choice. Sensei, he realized the driver was speaking to him. Yes, what will become of science after this? Takeda considered his answer carefully. Outside, far away, a faint glow still marked where Hiroshima smoldered. It looked almost like dawn if you did not know which direction you were facing. Science will go on, he said. Equations will still balance. Experiments will still be done. But after today, whenever someone speaks of the atom, they will see this. In his mind, he saw again the shadow of the man on the stairs, his outline burned into plaster where his body had been erased. They will see Hiroshima, he said, and they will know that our pride was nothing in the face of that light. 2 days later, on August 9th, as he sat at the same table revising his report for yet another transmission to Tokyo, another coded message arrived. A second city, another special bomb, Nagasaki. Similar destruction? The room spun around him for a moment. He gripped the edge of the table until the wood bit into his palms. So it had been confirmed. They had more than one. He did not cheer when he heard rumors that the emperor himself was convening a council to consider ending the war. He did not pray for victory or even for survival. He simply felt for the first time since he stepped into the gray silence of Hiroshima that reality had finally forced its way into the conversation at the highest level. That night he dreamed of walking again through the city. But this time, as he passed the melted glass and the burned shadows, he saw forms moving among the ruins that were not American or Japanese soldier or civilian. They were equations, half-finished experiments, chalk dust, and discarded reports. All the ways his country had chosen not to listen when the atom knocked quietly at their door. He woke with tears drying on his face, an ache in his bones, and a single clear thought in his mind, stark as the shadows on the walls of Hiroshima. It is over. Not just the war, though, that would soon follow. Over was an era in which Japan could pretend that will and courage were enough to bend the modern world. Over was the illusion that they stood shoulder to shoulder with the great industrial powers in every field. A single bomb had ripped that comfort away in one flash of unnatural daylight. On August 7th, 1945, walking through the vaporized heart of Hiroshima, the scientists of the Japanese army had already seen the future. They understood before most generals and ministers that there was no defense, no countermeasure, no miracle weapon waiting in some secret laboratory. They walked through the ruins of their cities and their certainties, and in that gray dust, Japan's scientific pride collapsed.